Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at the different types of economies and what features Australia has of each of these different types of economies. So basically what we're looking at is the different systems of ownership. Is it mainly privately owned businesses, or is it mainly state or government owned businesses like countries like North Korea? So countries can either have a more capitalist system where most businesses are privately owned. They can have a mixture of both privately and state-owned enterprises, with some government-owned enterprises like Australia Post and some private enterprises, or they can be mainly state-owned or government-owned enterprises. So market capitalism is a system whereby the price and quantity produced and sold are determined by supply and demand. So there's private ownership of resources, and it's up to demand and supply to determine what goods and services are produced. If things are in a high demand, then there'll be more production of those goods and services because they're more profitable. In a communist system, there's state-owned or government-owned ownership of all resources, and the government decides what is produced and how income is distributed, often setting 5 or 10-year plans about how they want to go about doing things. Then what we have is what we call a mixed economy. A mixed economy is where the government regulates the economy, but it's mainly up to the market to determine what goods and services are produced. So there's no purely free market economies in the world, and there's also no entirely planned economies. We tend to be on some mix where some countries are more closer to market economies and some are more close to plan where the government determines everything that is produced. So market capitalism, basically a market is any place where buyers and sellers interact and exchange goods and services. This interaction can take place in a physical location or it can be online. A market system is one that allocates resources based on consumers and producers' buying and selling decisions. So if prices rise, that gives a signal to producers to influence their behaviour as to where they're going to allocate their resources, their land, their labour and their capital. So capitalism is an economic system where the productive resources are owned by private individuals. So capitalism means private ownership, whereas the market part of it means that it's the markets and demand and supply that determine what is produced. So market capitalism, private ownership, the market, demand and supply determining what is produced. So capitalists use their assets to generate revenue, which motivates them to produce goods and services that are in demand. Planned socialism is completely different. It's one where the government is responsible for resource allocation. Governments set long-term or short-term plans about what is to produce and who is to receive the money. This is referred to as a planned economy. And when we hear the word socialism, socialism means that the majority of productive assets are owned by the state, and no one can benefit excessively from producing goods and services. So it's the government that owns the resources. Producers don't have the profit motive because the profits will flow back to the government. So socialism means that the government owns resources, and plan means that rather than demand and supply, the government dictates what is produced. The Australian economy is a mixed economy. We rely predominantly on the market, so demand and supply, with some government intervention to prevent over and under allocation of some resources. So if you look at a pure market economy, there's no government intervention in the market. All prices are determined by demand and supply. Things that are in higher demand receive higher profits, and resources will flow into those areas. Highly skilled workers would get paid high wages, and low-skilled workers would receive low wages. And everything that is produced would be dictated by consumers. If consumers want a good or service, then that would be produced. There would be nothing that's banned or nothing that's taxed to try and prevent people from using that good or service. And there's total privatisation of all resources. So no government-owned resources, everything's purely owned by the market and by the private individuals. Australia is a little bit different because we don't allow everything to be produced just because it's in high demand. So some things will be banned and some things will be taxed. So for example, in Australia, drugs and weapons are banned. You can't own machetes and things like that. And cigarettes and alcohol are also taxed to reduce consumption and production of those products. Other things like healthcare and education, which would be under-allocated in a free market, are subsidised. So the government gives money to consumers or producers so that we produce more of those goods and services. The government also provides other goods like defence and emergency services. They redistribute profits to the less fortunate through welfare and housing. And we also have things like minimum wages that influence markets so that low-skilled workers get protected. So there is government intervention within Australia through banning certain goods, through subsidising certain goods, through having things like a minimum wage. Okay, every country in the world has some mix between a more planned socialist economy and a market capitalist society. So private ownership of resources and demand and supply, these countries are government ownership of resources where the government sets set plans. In a market economy, it is predominantly consumers that determine what is produced. So basically, if self-interested producers will produce what consumers demand, because that's where they'll generate the most profit. So firms can generate more profit from selling what consumers desire, and therefore it's consumer sovereignty or consumers' choices that determine what is produced. So the idea of consumer sovereignty means consumer is king, and that is the idea. In a free market, consumers determine what is produced by their purchasing decisions. Producers will respond to consumers' choices and produce what consumers want to maximise their profits. Thank you.